Hello, I will do a presentation on comparing and contrasting between the documents of Vatican I and Vatican II. When I say Vatican I, I mean to include the syllabus of errors as well as the dogmatic constitution of the Church. The syllabus of errors is the document by Pope Pius IX, published in 1864, and then the dogmatic constitution of the Church is officially one of the Vatican I texts. Even though the syllabus of errors is not officially part of it, it's published within a few years and therefore has very similar attitudes and ideas. So when I refer to Vatican I mean both of these documents. So here's an overview. I will compare and contrast in these issues: state and church, public education, marriage, and the role of the Pope, and finally end with my reflection. The issue of state and church, Vatican I considers that the church should have temporal powers in order to carry out its mission, and you can find it in the syllabus of errors, paragraph 76. Let me navigate to it. So here's the statement that the Church condemns: the abolition of the temporal power of which the Apostolic See is possessed would contribute in the greatest degree to the liberty and prosperity of the Church. So, in other words, it's condemning the taking away the Church's political power. So that's Vatican I, that's in the syllabus of errors. And then Vatican II, you see a very different attitude. So let me go to Gaudium et Spes, paragraph 42. Okay, so here it says, Christ gave his church no proper mission in the political, economic, or social order. The purpose which he set before her is a religious one. So you see the church making a very clear statement that her mission is not about economics or politics, but religion. You find another statement similar to this one in Lumen Gentium, paragraph 1. The Church is in Christ like a sacrament, or as a sign and instrument both of a very closely knit union with God and of the unity of the whole human race. In other words, the Church's mission is to bring about salvation to the whole world, and it also shows forth what that salvation looks like in its members. Again, it's a religious mission, a purpose, a definition of the Church, very different from what Vatican I considered it's the Church to be. And this is understandable because Vatican I was after the French Revolution, during which many religious people were beheaded. And Vatican I, of course, when it came to grapple with the idea of democracy, it had the Church in France as an example to react against. But Vatican II was formulated about 100 years afterward. So we're talking about after the World Wars, after which the power has shifted to the US, where democracy is played out in a more friendly and peaceful way to the Catholic Church than the French Revolution. So it makes sense that the Vatican II can make these statements about democracy after 100 years. So now moving on to public education. Vatican II is tolerant of pluralism, and it hands over the responsibility of education to the state while keeping the church as part of faith formation. And we can find this in Gravissimum Educationis, paragraphs 5 to 7. Let me find it. Okay, so here it says, parents have the primary and inalienable right and duty to educate their children. The public power has the obligation to protect and defend the rights of the citizens and see to it that public subsidies are paid out in such a way that parents are truly free to choose according to their conscience the schools they want for their children. So this is saying that, this is very different from what we have in the US, where public schools are, public education is completely free, but Catholic private education is a hefty bill. So because of this difference in tuition, of course, parents are not free to choose the schools based on their conscience. Economics has a big role to play in their decision where they can or want to send their school kids. But Vatican II says that the public power has to make all of these schools, Catholic and public, equally affordable, so that the parents are free to choose based on their conscience, not forced by economic factors. And then, but it also allows room for parents to send their kids to public school and receive formation of the faith from the church. For example, it says here, the church must be present with her own special affection and help for the great number who are being trained in schools that are not Catholic. This is possible by the witness of the lives of those who teach and direct them, by the apostolic action of their fellow students, but especially by the ministry of priests and laymen who give them the doctrine of salvation in a way suited to their age and circumstances, and provide spiritual aid in every way the times and conditions allow. So this is something that we're familiar with in the US. Kids can go to a public school, and on Sunday the family would go to mass, and then kids would be pulled out for Sunday school. So the faith formation is done by church people, priests or catechists. Okay, next one is marriage. Again, we see Vatican I exercising or attempting to exercise more power than Vatican II. So the statement about marriage is found in the Syllabus of Errors, paragraphs 73 and 74. Matrimonial causes and espousals belong by their very nature to civil jurisdiction. So this is a syllabus of errors. So they are framed in a negative way. So basically, the church is condemning this type of belief. And then 73, a merely civil contract may, among Christians, constitute a true marriage. And it is false either that the marriage contract between Christians is always a sacrament, or that the contract is null if the sacrament be excluded. So let's say there's a marriage between two Christians that is acknowledged by the government, but according to the church it's not, so the sacrament is not there. Then what Vatican I is saying, then the contract is null. It's not valid. Effectively, it's making the church the one who can bestow validity on marriages. And let's go to Gaudium et Spes to see what Vatican II teaches about marriage, paragraph 48 and 52. Okay, paragraph 48. The intimate partnership of married life and love has been established by the Creator and qualified by His laws, and is rooted in the conjugal covenant of irrevocable personal consent. So, Vatican II teaches that the dignity of marriage comes from the Creator. Notice it doesn't say that it comes from the civil authorities. Rather, it comes from God, and it's irrevocable. We can see that Vatican II is teaching according to the scripture, where Jesus says, what God has joined, let no man separate. Then goes on to says, God Himself is the author of matrimony. So the dignity doesn't depend on governments, but on God Himself. And it also says that public authorities have the responsibility to protect marriages. And we can find this idea in paragraph 52. All those who exercise influence over communities and social groups should work efficiently for the welfare of marriage and the family. And so I'd just like to throw in a comment about our society today. One of the hot topics is same-sex marriage. The church, the Catholic Church, doesn't recognize such a union as a marriage, but the government does. And we can see how the church is expanding that the government has the responsibility to work for the welfare of marriage, but clearly it's not. And this is a problem when this kind of power is not within the church. And finally, we get to the topic of the Pope. And on this topic, both Vatican I and II affirm that the Pope is the supreme ruler over the whole church. He's the Bishop of Bishops. So let's go to the sources. Vatican I, you can find it in Dogmatic Constitution on the Catholic Faith, paragraph 2. Or chapter 2, maybe. So, in this paragraph here, the church talks about how Peter had primacy over the whole apostles. He was appointed by Jesus himself to be the leader of the church. And then this paragraph says, whoever succeeds to Peter in the sea does by the institution of Christ himself obtain the primacy of Peter over the whole church. So the Pope, because he's a successor of Peter, is head over the whole church. And you find a similar statement in Vatican II, the document Christus Dominus 283. Okay, I think there was supposed to be a comma, like paragraphs 28 and paragraph 3. So here in paragraph 3, bishops exercise this episcopal office of theirs, which they have received through the episcopal consecration in communion with and under the authority of the Supreme Pontiff. So here it's saying the Pope, even though he's a bishop himself, is higher than all of the other bishops. Because here it says with and under the authority of the Supreme Pontiff. So there's not a lot that has changed about the Church's understanding of the role of the Pope. So, okay, now I'd like to offer my reflection on the change between Vatican I and Vatican II. So as a whole, we know that law is built on a system of values, and it's not objectively clear in many cases, especially when it comes to values, how you can show one is better than the other. We see a lot of examples of this kind when you, let's say, at the individual level, like which one is more important? Is it the value of education or the value of friendship? There's no easy way to answer that, and these issues are. We have to take a stance on some of these questions of values, and that's what a law is. So it makes sense why Vatican I tried to impose power, church's power in politics, because if you really believe that what you teach is good for the welfare of humankind, then you want everyone to follow it. And what's the most direct way to make everyone to follow it other than to make it into a law? So that was the mentality of Vatican I. And now like I said before, any law is a promotion of some values at the suppression of others. And democracy supposedly promotes the values of the majority. So I said supposedly because earlier in the presentation, I presented the case of how schools are not equally treated. Catholic private schools are a lot more expensive than public education. So it's not necessarily about the value of the majority. Separation of state and church sometimes is actually a suppression of church, of religious values. But let's consider the ideal case of democracy. if we want a value to be turned into a law, then somehow that value has to become a part of the majority. And then democracy, by the way it's supposed to work, that value of the majority will become a law. So if Catholic values are to be put into a law, its teachings have to be accepted by the majority of the population. And this is the course of action adopted by Vatican II. In order to get the law to be consistent with Catholic teachings, you have to get people to believe in the teachings. And this is the Church's understanding of itself, that it's a sign and an instrument of salvation. So it tries to go about making its values into laws by first getting people to adopt it in their own hearts, in their minds, in their families. And this the Church aims to do through catechism, through evangelization. And it is consistent with the statement that Vatican II made. Church is a sacrament. It's a sign and instrument of salvation. So the role of teaching is extremely important in the Church's mission today. And that concludes my presentation, and at the end is a series of the links to all the documents that I used. Thank you.